The Duke served in her house in secret and learned why she feared love. 1971. The summer heat in Charleston, South Carolina, settled over the historic district like a thick wool blanket, making the air shimmer above the cobblestone streets. Margaret Ashford stood at the second-floor window of her family's antebellum mansion on Meeting Street, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained garden below. At 32, she had inherited more than just the house. She'd inherited the weight of expectations, the burden of scandal, and a heart she'd learned to keep locked away. The doorbell's chime echoed through the high-ceilinged rooms, and Margaret descended the curved staircase with practiced grace. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had taken ill that morning, leaving Margaret to manage the interviews for a temporary groundskeeper herself. She'd advertised discreetly. A household like the Ashfords didn't broadcast their need for help. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I read every single comment. Now let's get back to Margaret's story. She opened the heavy oak door to find a man who didn't fit Charleston's careful social mathematics. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen something harder than garden soil. His hair was dark, touched with premature grey at the temples, and he wore work clothes that had been carefully cleaned, but showed their age. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm here about the groundskeeper position. Name's Duke Harrison." His voice carried traces of Appalachia, the mountains of western North Carolina perhaps, softened by years of careful modulation. Margaret noticed how he stood, not quite at attention, but with a soldier's bearing that suggested recent military service. Vietnam, most likely. The war had sent thousands of young men home changed, and Charleston had absorbed its share of them. "Mr. Harrison," she replied, maintaining the formal distance that her position required. "Please come in." She led him through the entrance hall, past portraits of Ashford ancestors who seemed to judge every footstep, into the garden room that overlooked the grounds. The property stretched for nearly an acre, a small fortune of Charleston real estate that her family had clung to through wars, depressions, and the slow erosion of Southern aristocracy. "I'll be direct with you," Margaret said, clasping her hands in front of her. "My regular staff is temporarily unavailable, and I need someone who can maintain the gardens, handle basic repairs, and be discreet. This household values privacy." Duke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the coded language Charleston society used to discuss things it preferred to keep hidden. "I can do the work, ma'am. I grew up on a farm before I enlisted. 12 years in the service, honorable discharge 6 months ago. I know plants, I know repair work, and I know how to keep my mouth shut." "References?" He handed her a folder, worn at the edges. Inside were letters from his commanding officer, a minister in Asheville, and a family he'd done odd jobs for since returning stateside. Margaret read them carefully, noting the careful phrases. Reliable, trustworthy, suffered hardships with dignity. "You're overqualified for groundskeeping," she observed. "Maybe, but I need work that lets me think, keeps my hands busy, and doesn't require me to sit in an office." He paused. "I heard in town that working for the Ashfords meant privacy. That suited me fine." Margaret studied him. She recognized that look, the need to disappear into routine, to find peace in physical work. She'd seen it in her own mirror often enough. "The position is live-in," she said. "There's a carriage house that's been converted to a small apartment. Meals provided if you want them, though you're free to cook for yourself. $40 a week, paid in cash every Friday." "That's generous." "It's fair. Can you start tomorrow?" Duke nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity." After he left, Margaret stood in the garden room, watching his figure disappear down Meeting Street. She felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, the fear that always came with letting someone new into her carefully constructed world. Mrs. Patterson had been with her for years, understanding without words the boundaries that couldn't be crossed, the questions that couldn't be asked. But Mrs. Patterson's daughter in Colombia had gone into early labor, and Margaret couldn't begrudge her the time away. She'd simply have to be careful, as she always was. That evening, Margaret's sister Vivian called from Atlanta, her voice crackling through the long-distance line. "Have you found someone to help with the house?" Vivian asked, her tone carrying the mixture of concern and judgment that only a younger sister could perfect. "I hired a groundskeeper today. Former military, he seems competent." "You did background checks?" "Of course." Margaret wound the phone cord around her finger. "Vivian, I'm perfectly capable of hiring staff." "I know you are, Maggie. I just worry. After what happened with... We're not discussing that." Margaret's voice went flat, the warmth draining out of it like water from a cracked vase. "That's finished. It's been 5 years. The court papers said 7, and it's only been..." "Good night, Vivian." Margaret hung up before her sister could protest, her hand trembling slightly as she set the receiver back in its cradle. Some doors stayed closed for good reason. Some mistakes couldn't be discussed over telephone lines or garden party gossip without destroying whatever small piece you'd managed to build in their aftermath. She walked through the empty house, turning off lights, checking locks. The mansion felt too large for one person, its rooms echoing with absence. Her parents had died within a year of each other. Her father from a heart attack, her mother from what the doctors politely called complications. But Margaret knew was simply the loss of will to continue. She'd been left with the house, a modest trust fund, and instructions in her father's will that were more like commands. Maintain the family name, protect the family legacy, make no further scandals. Duke Harrison arrived at dawn the next morning, carrying a duffel bag and a toolbox that looked like it had survived 2 wars. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he surveyed the garden, walking the paths with careful attention, occasionally kneeling to examine a plant or test the soil with his fingers. She'd set out coffee and breakfast, a southern courtesy she couldn't quite abandon, on the small table in the carriage house. When Duke knocked on the kitchen door an hour later, she invited him in, with a formality that felt safer than warmth. "The garden needs work," he said, accepting the coffee she offered. "Azaleas are stressed from the heat, the fountain's pump is failing, and you've got Japanese beetles on the roses, but it's all fixable. Beautiful property, Mrs. Ashford. Someone loved this place once." The observation stung more than it should have. "My mother," Margaret said quietly. "She died 3 years ago. I've struggled to maintain her standards. Grief makes everything harder." It was a simple statement, but the way he said it, with understanding rather than pity, made Margaret look at him more carefully. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if expecting pain from unexpected angles. "Where did you serve?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. 2 tours in Vietnam, infantry, got home in December." He sipped his coffee. "That obvious? My cousin came back last year. He has the same watchfulness." Duke nodded. "It takes time to stop expecting the ground to explode under you. That's why I like garden work. Things grow on a schedule you can predict. Do the right things. They reward you. Simple." Over the following weeks, Duke transformed the garden. He arrived each morning as the sun touched the tops of the live oaks, worked steadily through the heat, and disappeared into the carriage house after dinner. Margaret found herself timing her walks through the garden to coincide with his work, watching from a distance as he coaxed the roses back to health, repaired the fountain, rebuilt the brick paths her father had let crumble. They developed a careful routine: coffee in the morning, brief conversations about the day's work, occasional shared meals when Margaret couldn't quite face eating alone at the long dining table. Duke never asked personal questions, never pushed beyond the boundaries she'd established, but his presence began to fill some of the empty spaces in the house. "You've done remarkable work," Margaret told him one evening in late July, standing beside the restored fountain as water cascaded over the aged stone. "My mother would have been pleased." "It's good work to do," Duke replied. "Restorative." "For the garden or for you?" He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Both, I suppose. There's peace in fixing broken things, making them whole again, reminds you it's possible." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the careful armor she'd maintained. "Is that what you needed? To remember it's possible?" Duke looked at her directly then, and she saw the same fear she carried, the fear that damage could be permanent, that some breaks couldn't be mended. "Every day," he said softly. "Every single day." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding, until Margaret's neighbour, Mrs. Whitmore, called over the garden wall. "Margaret, dear, I'm having a few ladies over for bridge tomorrow. Will you join us?" The spell broke. Margaret stepped away from Duke, her posture straightening, her voice taking on the polished tone of Charleston society. "How lovely, Eleanor! What time?" As she walked back to the house, she felt Duke's eyes on her back and wondered what he'd seen in that brief, unguarded moment. She wondered if he'd recognized the same thing she'd seen in him. Someone trying desperately to rebuild a life from scattered pieces while pretending the breaks had never happened. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret stood in her father's study, looking at the locked drawer she hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside were the papers, court documents, police reports, custody orders. Inside was the evidence of the worst mistake of her life, carefully filed away where Charleston's gossip couldn't reach it. She'd told everyone she was divorced. That was true enough. But the whole truth was locked in that drawer, guarded by shame and lawyers' fees and the judge's final words. "Mrs. Ashford, your choices have consequences. Your daughter deserves better than what you've proven capable of providing." Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the drawer and wondered if Duke had his own locked boxes, his own carefully hidden truths. She wondered if that's what she'd recognized in him. Not just the marks of war, but the weight of carrying secrets too heavy to share. In the carriage house, Duke sat on the narrow bed, holding a photograph he'd carried through 2 tours of Vietnam. A woman and a small child, both smiling at a church picnic somewhere in the mountains before the world had fallen apart. Before the accusations, the trial, the dishonorable discharge he'd fought for 3 years to overturn. Before he'd learned that innocence didn't matter as much as evidence, and sometimes evidence could be manufactured by people who wanted you gone. He'd come to Charleston because it was far from Asheville, far from the whispers and pointing fingers. He'd taken the name Harrison, his mother's maiden name, and tried to build something new from the wreckage of his old life. And now he was working for a woman who looked at him with haunted eyes that matched his own, and he wondered what she was hiding behind Charleston's carefully maintained facade. He wondered if she'd still look at him that way, if she knew what he'd been accused of, what the court had believed despite his protests. Some truths, Duke thought, were better left buried. Some gardens grew better when you didn't dig too deep into the soil, but as summer deepened and the heat pressed down on Charleston like a judgment, both Margaret and Duke would learn that buried truths have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, and that sometimes the only way to truly heal is to face exactly what you've been running from. August arrived with temperatures that made the Charleston heat feel personal, like the sun had decided to settle its full weight directly on Meeting Street. Margaret found herself spending more time in the garden, ostensibly supervising Duke's work, but truthfully seeking his quiet company. They'd fallen into conversations that felt dangerously comfortable. Discussions about books, about the changing South, about small philosophies that revealed more than either of them intended. My father believed the past was sacred, Margaret said one afternoon, sitting on the garden bench while Duke pruned the overgrown wisteria. That maintaining tradition was more important than personal happiness. Lots of fathers believed that, Duke replied, his hands steady on the clippers, especially men who'd built something they thought was worth protecting. Did you agree with him? Margaret watched a butterfly settle on a nearby azalea. I tried to. I tried very hard to be the daughter he wanted, but I made choices that disappointed him, choices I'm still paying for. Duke climbed down from the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead. We all make choices we regret. The question is whether we get the chance to make better ones. What if the chance is gone? What if you can't undo what's been done? He looked at her with those steady eyes that had seen too much. Then maybe you don't undo it. Maybe you just build something new alongside the ruins. Let it exist, but don't let it be the only thing that defines you. Before Margaret could respond, the phone rang inside the house. She excused herself, grateful for the interruption before she said too much, revealed too much of the raw places she usually kept hidden. It was her lawyer, David Brennan, calling from his office on Broad Street. Margaret, we need to discuss something. Can you come to my office this afternoon? The tone in his voice made her stomach tighten. What's wrong? It's about the custody arrangement. Your ex-husband has filed a motion to modify the agreement. He's claiming changed circumstances and wants to reduce your visitation rights entirely. The world tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of the hall table, her knuckles white. On what grounds? I've followed every requirement. I've done everything the court ordered. I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be here at 3? A day after she hung up, Margaret stood in the dim hallway, her carefully constructed stability crumbling like the brick paths Duke had recently repaired. 5 years. She'd spent 5 years proving she was different, better, safe. And now Richard was trying to take away even the limited time she had with Caroline. She found Duke still working in the garden, preparing to edge the lawn. I need to go out, she said, her voice tight. I'll be back this evening. He looked up, immediately sensing something wrong. Everything all right? No, but there's nothing you can do about it. David Brennan's office smelled of old paper and furniture polish, the scent of Charleston's legal establishment. He was in his 50s, patient and methodical, one of the few lawyers who'd been willing to represent her during the divorce. Richard's attorney claims you've been reckless, David said, spreading papers across his desk. They're alleging you've hired a male servant to live on the property without proper vetting, that you're creating an unstable environment for visitation. Margaret felt ice flood her veins. That's absurd. I hired a groundskeeper. Mrs. Patterson was away, and I needed help maintaining the property. I did background checks. Did you verify his military discharge status? His employment history? Run a criminal background check? I checked his references, his discharge papers. I spoke with his former employer. David's expression was grave. Richard's investigator dug deeper. Your Mr. Harrison was court-martialed 3 years ago on charges of assault. The charges were later dismissed, and he received an honorable discharge on appeal. But the case file exists. Richard's attorney is arguing that you're exposing Caroline to potential danger. The room seemed to compress around her. Duke wouldn't, he's not. I believe you, Margaret, but this isn't about truth. It's about what Richard can make a judge believe. He's been looking for any opportunity to restrict your access to Caroline. This gave him ammunition. Margaret stood, pacing to the window that overlooked Broad Street. Below, tourists wandered through Charleston's historic district, oblivious to the dramas playing out in the offices above them. What was he accused of? She asked quietly. Assaulting a superior officer. The file says there was a situation involving his daughter, accusations that were later proven false, but it got messy. The officer apparently made threats. Harrison reacted physically. The whole thing was eventually dismissed when evidence came out that the original accusations against Harrison were fabricated, but it took 3 years of appeals. Margaret closed her eyes. Duke had a daughter. He'd been accused of something involving his daughter, and he'd come to Charleston hiding that history just as she'd hidden hers. "What do I do?" she asked. "Terminate his employment immediately. Show the court you take their concerns seriously. Then we file a response demonstrating that you've corrected the situation and followed all proper procedures going forward." "And if I don't?" David's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Then you risk losing visitation entirely. Richard has a new wife, a stable home, and no scandals in his past. The court already views you as the less reliable parent. You can't give them any more reasons to limit your time with Caroline." Margaret drove back to Meeting Street in a fog, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. She'd built such careful walls around her life, maintained such strict control over every variable, and now it was all collapsing because she'd trusted someone, because she'd let someone in. Duke was planting new hydrangeas along the north wall when she arrived. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the exact moment he registered her expression. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to speak with you." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Inside." They sat in the garden room, the space that had become their informal meeting place. Margaret couldn't look at him directly. "Were you court-martialed?" she asked. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. "Yes," Duke finally said. 3 years ago. The charges were dismissed and my discharge was changed to honorable on appeal. But yes, there was a court-martial. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people hear court-martial and stop listening. They don't wait for dismissed. They don't care about appeals or evidence or the truth. They just hear the accusation and decide you're guilty." Margaret finally looked at him. "What happened?" Duke's jaw tightened. "My daughter, Emma, she was 6. My commanding officer made inappropriate advances toward her at a family event on base. She told me, I confronted him, he denied it. Then suddenly Emma was being questioned about things I'd allegedly done, and there was a formal investigation. My CO claimed I'd assaulted him when he tried to question me about the accusations against me. But you were cleared. Eventually. It took 3 years, 2 lawyers I couldn't afford, and a psychologist's testimony that Emma had been coached by my CO's wife. Turns out they'd done it before. Targeted families they wanted transferred off base. By the time the truth came out, my marriage was destroyed, my reputation was gone, and I'd lost custody of Emma. Her mother wanted nothing to do with the mess. She remarried and moved to California. I get a letter twice a year and a phone call on Emma's birthday." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm sorry. Why are you asking now?" She told him about Richard's motion, about the investigator, about the custody hearing that would determine whether she'd continue to see Caroline once a month or lose her completely. "My lawyer says I have to fire you," she finished, "that it's the only way to show the court I'm taking their concerns seriously." Duke nodded slowly. "I understand. When do you want me gone?" "I don't want you gone." The words burst out before she could stop them. "I don't want any of this. I don't want to have to prove I'm safe every single day. I don't want to have to choose between keeping help I trust and seeing my daughter. I don't want to live in a world where one mistake defines you forever." "What was your mistake?" Duke asked quietly. Margaret had never told anyone except her lawyer and the court-ordered therapist. Her family knew only what they'd read in the divorce papers, and Charleston society knew only what they'd whispered about over garden parties and church socials. But sitting in that garden room with Duke, who understood what it meant to be judged for things you couldn't undo, she found herself telling him everything. "I was 27 when I married Richard. Good family, proper courtship, wedding at St. Michael's Church with 300 guests. We bought a house in the historic district, and I got pregnant right away. Caroline was born 9 months later, perfect and beautiful, and I thought I had everything I was supposed to want. She paused, gathering the courage to continue. But I was drowning. Postpartum depression, though we didn't call it that then, I was just having trouble adjusting. Richard worked constantly, and I was alone with Caroline, and I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop the thoughts that told me I was failing, that I was going to hurt her somehow. I was terrified of myself. Did you get help? I tried. I told Richard I needed to see someone, but he said I was being dramatic. His mother said all new mothers felt overwhelmed and I just needed to pray more. So I self-medicated. I started taking pills, my mother's old prescriptions from when she had her nerves. It helped at first, made everything feel distant, manageable. Margaret's voice dropped to almost a whisper. One afternoon when Caroline was 18 months old, I took too much. I don't remember it clearly. I'd been taking pills all week, not sleeping, barely eating. I put Caroline down for her nap and took what I thought was my usual dose. But I passed out, completely unconscious on the bathroom floor. Duke didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just listened. Richard came home early and found me. Caroline was still in her crib screaming. She'd been crying for hours. She was fine physically, but Richard called his lawyer before he called a doctor. By the time I woke up in the hospital, he'd already filed for divorce and emergency custody. He told the court I was an unfit mother, that I'd endangered our daughter's life through neglect, that I was an addict. Were you? Margaret met his eyes. Yes, I was. I am. I've been sober for 5 years. I go to meetings twice a week in Colombia where no one knows me, and I follow every requirement the court set. But Richard makes sure I never forget. The custody arrangement allows me 1 supervised visit per month, 4 hours, at a neutral location with a social worker present. Caroline doesn't really know me. She calls me Miss Margaret because she doesn't remember I'm her mother. The weight of it hung between them. 2 people who'd made mistakes, faced consequences, and were still paying for them years later. I have to fire you, Margaret said finally. Not because I think you're dangerous, but because I can't risk losing the 4 hours a month I get with my daughter. That's all I have left of her, and if I lose that, then you should protect it, Duke said. I understand. I've made the same choice, giving up what I wanted to protect what little I had left. I'll give you 2 weeks' pay and a reference letter. I'll help you find another position. I appreciate that. Duke stood, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, Mrs. Ashford, I think you're a better mother than you give yourself credit for. The fact that you're willing to sacrifice what you need to protect your daughter's best interests, that's what good parents do. After he left, Margaret sat alone in the garden room as twilight settled over Charleston. She'd done the right thing, the responsible thing. So why did it feel like she'd just lost something she'd never have the chance to find again? In the carriage house, Duke packed his few belongings and wondered if he'd ever stop running from his past. He'd thought Charleston might be far enough, different enough to offer a fresh start. But the past had a way of following you, of showing up in court papers and investigators' reports, of ruining anything good before it had a chance to grow. He thought about Margaret's confession, about the courage it took to admit you'd failed at the thing that mattered most. He thought about Emma, growing up in California with a stepfather who'd never know about the court-martial or the accusations or the 3 years Duke had spent fighting to prove his innocence. And he thought about Margaret's eyes when she'd said, "I don't want to live in a world where one mistake defines you forever." Neither did he, but wanting something different didn't make it true. The next morning, Duke was loading his truck when Mrs. Patterson arrived back from Colombia. She was in her 60s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "You're leaving?" she asked, watching him secure his toolbox. "Mrs. Ashford had to let me go. Legal situation with her ex-husband." Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. That man is a snake. Always has been. Broke Miss Margaret's heart and then spent 5 years grinding the pieces into dust. She told me about it, about what happened. Did she tell you the whole story about how Richard knew she was struggling after Carolyn was born? How he refused to get her help because it might look bad for his law practice? How he waited until she made one mistake and then used it to destroy her? Duke paused. She said she endangered Caroline. She fell asleep, that's all. She was exhausted and overwhelmed and self-medicating because no one would help her, and she fell asleep. Caroline cried for a few hours. She wasn't hurt, wasn't in danger, just scared and upset. But Richard spun it into child endangerment and paraded her before a judge like she was a criminal. The court agreed with him. Because he had money and lawyers and a reputation. Because Miss Margaret was too depressed and guilty to fight back properly. Because the world doesn't have much mercy for women who admit they're struggling. Mrs. Patterson fixed him with a sharp look. She's spent 5 years proving she's better, and he's spent 5 years looking for ways to take away even the little bit of motherhood she has left, and now he's using you to do it. I didn't mean to cause problems. I know you didn't. But you should also know, Miss Margaret doesn't let people in. She's careful about who she trusts, who she tells things to. If she told you about Caroline, it means something, and that man is trying to take away one more thing she cares about. After Mrs. Patterson went inside, Duke sat in his truck and thought about gardens, about how sometimes plants needed deep roots to survive storms, but they couldn't grow those roots if the ground kept shifting under them. About how you couldn't restore something beautiful if you kept abandoning it when the work got difficult. He thought about Margaret's face when she'd said she had to fire him, the resignation in it, the acceptance that this was just how her life worked. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Try to build something, watch it get torn down. And he thought about Emma, and the life he'd lost, and whether running to Charleston had been about finding peace, or just finding a new place to hide from the fact that some fights were worth having, even when you'd already lost them once before. Inside the house, Margaret was meeting with David Brennan again. Richard's hearing is set for September 15th, David said. You'll need to demonstrate that you've taken corrective action regarding the employment situation and that you're maintaining a stable environment. I've prepared a response that emphasizes your compliance with all court orders and your continued sobriety. Will it be enough? I don't know. Richard's been planning this for a while. He's documented every supervised visit, looking for any sign that Caroline is uncomfortable or that you're not following protocols. He's built a case that you're still unstable, still a risk. Margaret felt the familiar despair rising. I'll never be good enough. No matter what I do, he'll find something wrong with it. That may be true, but we fight anyway. Because giving up means losing Caroline completely, and I don't think you're ready to do that. She wasn't. She'd never be ready to do that. But she was tired, so tired of fighting battles where the rules kept changing, where the evidence of her improvement never seemed to matter as much as the evidence of her past failure. That evening, Margaret walked through the garden Duke had restored. The roses bloomed in perfect rows, the fountain sang its gentle song, and the paths lay straight and true. In 6 weeks, he'd brought her mother's garden back to life, and in doing so, had brought something back to life in Margaret too, a small, tentative hope that broken things could be made whole again. Now he was gone, and she was left with the garden and the ghosts and the endless work of proving she deserved the smallest scraps of her daughter's life. She was standing by the fountain when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Duke walking across the lawn, still carrying his truck keys. "I thought you left," she said. "I was about to, but Mrs. Patterson said something that made me think." He stopped a few feet away, maintaining the careful distance they'd always kept. She said you don't let people in, that if you told me about Caroline, it meant something. Margaret's throat tightened. Duke, I've spent 3 years running from what happened to me, moving from place to place, taking jobs where nobody asks questions, keeping my head down. I told myself it was about starting over, but really it was about hiding, about accepting that the world had decided who I was, and I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. You were protecting yourself. That's not wrong. Maybe not. But it's not living either. It's just existing in the spaces between other people's judgments. He took a step closer. You asked me what I needed. If I needed to remember it was possible to fix broken things. I think what I really needed was to find someone else who understood that being broken doesn't make you worthless. That mistakes don't have to be the end of the story. But they are the end, Margaret said softly. We can't change what happened. We can't undo the damage or take back the choices we made. The world sees us a certain way, and nothing we do will ever fully change that. You're right. But maybe we don't have to let that be the only truth about us. Maybe we can build something new, not by forgetting or hiding what happened, but by refusing to let it be the final word. Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that courage and determination could overcome the weight of past mistakes. But she'd tried that already, tried to rebuild herself into someone worthy of her daughter's love, and Richard was still finding ways to tear her down. If you stay, it makes things worse, she said. It gives Richard more ammunition. It confirms everything he's claiming about me being reckless and unstable. Then let's make it different. Let's show the court exactly who I am and why I'm here. No hiding, no secrets. Full transparency about my history and my credentials. Character references from my commanding officers, from the psychologist who testified at my appeal, from the families I've worked for. Make it so thorough that Richard can't twist it into something dangerous. That would expose everything. Everyone would know about the court-martial, about Emma, about the fact that I was falsely accused and cleared of all charges. About the fact that I spent 3 years fighting to prove my innocence and won. Yes, they'd know all of it. And maybe for once, the whole truth would matter more than the convenient version people prefer to believe. Margaret stared at him. You'd really do that? You'd open up your entire history for lawyers to pick apart, just to help me with a custody hearing? I'd do it because it's the truth, and because I'm tired of letting lies define me, and because... He paused. Because you trusted me with your story, and that meant something, because in 6 weeks you've reminded me what it feels like to wake up without feeling like a failure. Because I think maybe we could both use someone on our side who understands what it's like to keep fighting, even when you're not sure you can win. Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes. I can't ask you to do this. You're not asking, I'm offering. But I need to know, is this just about the custody hearing, or is there something else happening here? The question hung between them like the humid Charleston air, heavy, inescapable, demanding an answer Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to give. I don't know, she admitted. I've been so focused on surviving, on following all the rules and maintaining control, that I haven't let myself feel anything in 5 years. Not hope, not happiness, not connection. Not connection, she finished quietly. Duke nodded. I understand. And I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I'm just saying, let me stay. Let me help you fight this. And let's see if maybe, somewhere in all this mess, we can build something worth fighting for. Margaret looked at him standing in her mother's garden, this man who'd served his country and lost his daughter and carried his own weight of mistakes and accusations. She thought about the careful walls she'd built around her life and about what might happen if she let someone help carry the burden instead of shouldering it alone. Okay, she said, but we do this properly. No more secrets, no more hidden histories. Everything documented and verified. If we're going to fight this, we fight it with truth." Agreed. As Duke walked back to the carriage house to unpack his truck, Mrs. Patterson watched from the kitchen window with a small, satisfied smile. She'd seen enough in her 63 years to recognize two souls who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate disasters. She'd also seen enough to know that the real fight was just beginning, because Richard Ashford didn't lose gracefully, and Charleston society didn't forgive easily, and the road ahead would test both Margaret and Duke in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But sometimes, she thought, the best gardens grew from the most damaged soil. Sometimes restoration required tearing everything down to the roots and starting over with patience and faith and the willingness to believe that growth was still possible, even after the harshest winter. The question was whether Margaret and Duke had the strength to see it through, or whether Charleston's carefully maintained facade would bury their fragile hope before it had a chance to bloom. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints that Charleston's suffocating summer might finally release its grip. Margaret and Duke spent 2 weeks building the most thorough documentation either of them had ever seen. Service records, psychological evaluations, character references, employment histories, and detailed timelines that left no gaps for Richard's lawyers to exploit. David Brennan reviewed everything with meticulous attention. "This is either brilliant or insane," he told Margaret in his office. "You're essentially putting both of you on trial in order to prove you're responsible enough to maintain supervised visitation." "That's because we're not hiding anymore," Margaret said. "If Richard wants to use Duke's history against me, then let's show the judge the whole truth, not the convenient fragments Richard wants to present." "And you, Mr. Harrison? You're comfortable with having your entire military service and court-martial proceedings entered into a civilian custody case?" Duke sat in the leather chair across from David's desk, his posture straight but relaxed. "I'm comfortable with the truth. I spent 3 years clearing my name. If it helps Margaret keep access to her daughter, then it's worth doing again." David studied him carefully. "You understand that Richard's attorney will try to make you look dangerous. They'll focus on the assault charge, minimize the exoneration, suggest that anyone who was even accused of such things is inherently unsafe around children. Let them try. I have documentation that every charge was dismissed with prejudice. I have testimony from the psychologist who evaluated Emma and determined she'd been coached. I have statements from 3 other families that my CO and his wife had targeted the same way. The truth is a lot stronger than what Richard wants people to believe." Over those 2 weeks, Margaret and Duke also spent more time together, working in the garden, sharing meals, talking about their lives with a honesty neither had experienced in years. Mrs. Patterson watched this development with approval, though she maintained her discretion and let the relationship develop at its own pace. "How often do you see Emma?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat in the garden room after dinner. "I got a letter last week. Her mother sends updates every 6 months. Emma's 9 now. She's in 4th grade, plays soccer, likes science class. Her stepfather seems like a good man, better than I could have been, given everything that happened." Duke's voice carried carefully controlled emotion. "Do you regret it? Fighting so hard to clear your name when it didn't bring her back?" "No, because it was about more than getting Emma back. It was about the principle that accusations require proof, that evidence matters, that you can't just destroy someone's life based on lies and expect no consequences. The CO who targeted us lost his position and took early retirement. The system learned something. That matters, even if I lost Emma in the process." Margaret understood. "That's why you're helping me, not because you think I'll win, but because the fight itself matters." "I think you'll win. But yes, the fight matters." Because Caroline deserves to know her mother tried everything to stay in her life. Because Richard doesn't get to rewrite history without someone challenging his version. Because sometimes the only way to prove you've changed is to show you're willing to face the truth about who you were. The custody hearing was scheduled for September 15th at 9 o'clock in the morning. The night before, Margaret barely slept. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the pre-dawn darkness, thinking about Caroline, her daughter who barely knew her, who'd grown from a toddler to a 7-year-old in the gaps between supervised visits. She thought about the last visit, how Caroline had sat across the table in the supervised visitation center and colored pictures, while the social worker watched every interaction. How Caroline had called her Miss Margaret, even when Margaret had gently reminded her, "You can call me Mom, sweetheart." Caroline had looked up with innocent confusion. "But Daddy says Mom is the name for people who take care of you. And Miss Julie takes care of me." Miss Julie, Richard's new wife, the woman who'd stepped into the space Margaret had lost through her own mistakes, the woman Caroline now called Mom. Margaret had smiled and said, "That's okay, sweetie. You can call me whatever feels comfortable." But inside, she'd felt something die, another small piece of herself that she'd tried so hard to preserve. The courthouse was busy on Tuesday morning. Margaret arrived with David Brennan and Duke, all three dressed conservatively for court. Richard was already there with his attorney, Gerald Thompson, a senior partner at one of Charleston's most prestigious firms. Richard looked prosperous and confident, his new wife Julie beside him in a pale blue suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. "Mrs. Ashford," Richard greeted her with cool politeness. "Gerald, I see you've brought your groundskeeper to court." "Mr. Harrison is here as a character witness," David replied smoothly. "He's fully prepared to testify about the circumstances of Mrs. Ashford's household and his own qualifications." Nay, Gerald Thompson looked Duke up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Yes, I'm sure the court will be very interested in hearing about Mr. Harrison's qualifications. We certainly are." The courtroom was smaller than Margaret expected, wood-panelled and formal. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, but little patience for games. Margaret had researched her carefully. Judge Morrison had 3 children of her own and supposedly believed strongly in preserving parental rights when possible, but when possible was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "This is a hearing on the motion to modify filed by Mr. Richard Ashford," Judge Morrison began, after they'd all taken their seats. "Mr. Thompson, you may proceed." Gerald Thompson stood and presented his case with smooth efficiency. He painted a picture of Margaret as someone still struggling with stability, hiring questionable staff without proper vetting, living alone in a large house with male servants in residence, failing to maintain the social connections and community support that would demonstrate mental health improvement. "Your Honor, my client is not seeking to be cruel," Thompson said in tones that suggested great reasonableness. "He simply wants to ensure that his daughter is in a safe, stable environment during any visitation." Mrs. Ashford's recent decision to employ a man with a documented history of violence, allowing him to live on the property where his daughter occasionally visits, demonstrates a pattern of poor judgment that the court should take seriously. "Mr. Brennan?" Judge Morrison gestured for David to respond. David stood, and Margaret felt her heart hammering. This was it, the moment when everything either held together or fell apart. "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson's characterization deliberately misrepresents both my client's actions and Mr. Harrison's history. With the court's permission, I'd like to enter into evidence a complete timeline of Mr. Harrison's military service, court-martial proceedings, appeal, and subsequent exoneration." He placed a thick folder in front of the judge. "As you'll see, Mr. Harrison was accused of assault in 2021, following an incident where he confronted his commanding officer about inappropriate behavior toward his daughter Emma, then age 6. The commanding officer filed assault charges. However, a thorough investigation revealed that the CO had actually fabricated accusations against Mr. Harrison in retaliation, and had coached multiple children, including Emma, to make false statements. Judge Morrison was reading through the documents with focused attention. The court-martial was overturned on appeal, David continued. Mr. Harrison's discharge was changed from dishonorable to honorable, with full benefits restored. The CO in question was forced into early retirement and is currently under investigation by military authorities for similar incidents involving other families. Mr. Harrison is not a violent man who was gotten off on a technicality. He is a veteran who was targeted, fought to clear his name, and succeeded in proving his innocence. There is a significant difference. Mr. Thompson, Judge Morrison looked up. Do you dispute these facts? Gerald Thompson looked less confident now. Your Honor, the fact remains that Mr. Harrison was involved in a physical altercation with a superior officer. After that officer threatened his 6-year-old daughter and then fabricated abuse allegations to cover his own misconduct, David interrupted. The military's own investigation confirmed this. Every charge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled, and were found to be without merit. And Mrs. Ashford was aware of this history when she hired him? Judge Morrison asked. Margaret stood, her voice steady. I performed reference checks, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison provided documentation of his honorable discharge and references from his commanding officers and previous employers. When my ex-husband's investigation revealed the court-martial, I chose to investigate further rather than immediately terminate Mr. Harrison's employment. I learned the full story, that he had been falsely accused, had fought for 3 years to clear his name, and had ultimately been vindicated by the military justice system. That demonstrated to me exactly the kind of person he is, someone who fights for truth and justice even when it's difficult, and someone who was willing to be transparent about his history rather than hide it. That's very noble, Richard's attorney said dryly. But it doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Ashford could have chosen to hire someone without such a complicated background. Her choice to keep Mr. Harrison employed demonstrates poor judgment. Aye. Or it demonstrates compassion and critical thinking, David countered. Mrs. Ashford refused to let false accusations define someone's worth. She looked at the evidence, understood the truth, and made a decision based on facts rather than fear. That's exactly the kind of judgment we should want from a parent. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair. I'd like to hear from Mr. Harrison directly. Mr. Harrison, please approach. Duke stood and walked to the witness stand with military bearing. After being sworn in, he sat calmly while Gerald Thompson positioned himself for cross-examination. Mr. Harrison, you've lost custody of your daughter, correct? Yes, sir. Because your ex-wife believed you were a danger to the child? No, sir. Because my ex-wife couldn't handle the stress of the court-martial and the investigation. She made a choice to protect Emma from the situation, not from me. The court found no evidence that I was ever a danger to Emma. But you did physically assault your commanding officer? I pushed him away from my daughter when he was standing too close to her at a base family event. He'd made comments to her that frightened her. Later that evening, I went to his office to formally report the incident. He became aggressive, claimed I was making false accusations, and when I attempted to leave, he blocked the doorway. I moved him aside, not violently, but firmly, and left. 2 days later, he filed assault charges and simultaneously accused me of abusing Emma to preempt my report against him. That's a very convenient narrative. It's the truth, as confirmed by 3 years of investigation, witness testimony, and psychological evaluation of Emma by an independent expert. Yet you've lost contact with your daughter. Duke's expression remained steady, but Margaret saw the pain flicker in his eyes. Yes, sir. Emma's mother remarried and moved to California. She believed it was best for Emma to have stability and distance from the situation. I receive updates and I send letters. It's not what I wanted, but it's what was necessary for Emma's well-being. Sometimes loving a child means accepting decisions you don't agree with because they serve the child's best interests. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, why did you agree to testify here today? Surely you understood it would expose your history to further scrutiny. Duke looked directly at the judge. Because Mrs. Ashford is a good mother who made a mistake 5 years ago, has done everything required to prove she's better, and is still being punished as if she's the same person she was during her worst moment. I know what it's like to be defined by accusations and past mistakes rather than who you've become. I thought maybe my story could help the court see the difference between someone who's dangerous and someone who's damaged, but working to heal. And do you believe Mrs. Ashford has healed? I believe she's doing the work. I've watched her maintain sobriety, follow every court requirement, prepare for her visits with Caroline with incredible care. I've seen her turn down social invitations and maintain strict routines to prove she's stable. That's not someone who's reckless or indifferent. That's someone who's dedicated to being better. Thompson jumped on that. You've watched her. How closely have you been observing Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Harrison? I work on her property, sir. I see how she lives, how she prepares for visitation days, how carefully she maintains the household. It's not surveillance. It's simply being present in the same space. And have you developed feelings for Mrs. Ashford during this presence? Margaret felt her heart stop. This was it, the trap Thompson had been building toward. Duke met the attorney's eyes directly. I respect Mrs. Ashford. I admire her strength and her dedication to her daughter. Whether those feelings constitute more than professional respect is irrelevant to these proceedings. I disagree. If you're romantically interested in my client's ex-wife, it calls into question your objectivity and suggests Mrs. Ashford is involved in an inappropriate relationship while claiming to maintain a stable environment for her daughter. Judge Morrison held up a hand. Mr. Thompson, unless you're alleging something specific and relevant to the child's welfare, I'd like to move on. Mrs. Ashford's personal relationships are not at issue unless they directly impact Caroline's safety during supervised visitation. Thompson backed off, but Margaret saw Richard's expression, satisfaction mixed with calculation. He thought he'd found the angle that would work. The hearing continued for another hour. Richard testified about his concerns, painting himself as the reasonable parent trying to protect his daughter from Margaret's supposedly questionable judgment. Julie testified about Caroline's happy, stable home life, subtly emphasizing everything Margaret couldn't provide. When it was Margaret's turn, she spoke clearly about her 5 years of sobriety, her therapy, her commitment to following every court requirement. She didn't minimize what had happened. She owned it completely, while demonstrating how far she'd come. I made a terrible mistake, she told Judge Morrison. I endangered my daughter through my own inability to ask for help when I desperately needed it. But I've spent every day since then proving I'm different. Not perfect, I'll never be perfect, but safe, stable, and dedicated to being the mother Caroline deserves, even if that's only 4 hours a month. Judge Morrison reviewed her notes, the silence in the courtroom stretching unbearably. I'm going to take this under advisement, she finally said. I'll issue my ruling within 2 weeks. This hearing is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Richard approached Margaret while Duke and David were conferring nearby. You can't win this, Margaret, Richard said quietly. Even if the judge doesn't rule in my favor today, I'll keep finding reasons. Every small mistake, every questionable decision, I'll document it and bring it back. You'll spend the rest of Caroline's childhood proving yourself over and over, and you'll still lose in the end. Why? Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Why do you hate me this much? I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes, but she's my daughter too. Why are you so determined to erase me from her life? Richard's expression hardened. Because I can't trust you. Because every time Caroline comes back from visiting you, she's confused about who her real mother is. Because Julie has been more of a mother to her than you ever were, and you don't deserve to disrupt the stability we've built. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I just want to know my daughter. You should have thought of that before you passed out and left her screaming in her crib for hours. Richard turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing on the courthouse steps feeling like she'd been gutted. Duke found her there 5 minutes later, staring at nothing. "Let's go home," he said gently. The 2 weeks of waiting were torture. Margaret maintained her routines, her meetings, her therapy appointments, her careful documentation of everything she did. Duke continued working in the garden, and they continued sharing meals and conversations, but the weight of the pending decision hung over everything. Mrs. Patterson, watching them dance around each other, finally lost patience. "For heaven's sake," she said one evening, finding them sitting at opposite ends of the garden bench, like teenagers at a church social. "The court is deciding whether you get to see your daughter, not whether you're allowed to have feelings for each other. You're both adults. Act like it." After she'd gone back inside, Duke turned to Margaret. "She's not wrong. I can't think about this right now. I can't think about anything except whether I'm going to lose Caroline completely. Then let me think about it for both of us. Let me tell you what I see." Duke shifted closer. "I see a woman who's brave enough to fight impossible battles, who owns her mistakes instead of hiding from them, who treats a broken-down veteran with kindness instead of suspicion, who's rebuilt herself into someone strong and honest and possibly about to lose the one thing that matters most. Yes, and if that happens, it will be the most unjust thing I've witnessed since watching the military try to destroy my life over lies. But Margaret, win or lose, you're not alone in this. Not anymore." She finally looked at him. Really looked at him. "What are we doing, Duke? I think we're giving each other a reason to keep fighting. I think we're proving that damaged people can still build something good together. I think—" He paused. "I think I'm falling in love with you, and the timing is terrible. But there it is." Margaret felt tears spill over. "The timing is terrible, and I don't know if I have anything to offer you except complications and supervised visitation schedules and an ex-husband who'll use this against me. I'll take it, all of it, if you want me to." She kissed him then, soft and careful, like something fragile that might break. When they pulled apart, she said, "If we lose the hearing, I don't know if I'll survive it. You will, and I'll be here to make sure of it." The ruling came on a Tuesday afternoon. David called Margaret at home, his voice carefully neutral. "The judge wants to see everyone in chambers tomorrow at 2:00. She's issuing her decision then." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about Caroline, about all the moments she'd missed, first days of school, lost teeth, birthday parties, bedtime stories. She thought about the little girl who called another woman Mom, and looked at Margaret with polite confusion. At dawn, she found Duke already in the garden, working despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Figured I might as well do something productive." He paused in his work. "Whatever happens today, Margaret, you've fought honorably. You've done everything right. If the system still fails you, that's the system's failure, not yours." "Tell me about Emma," Margaret said suddenly. "Tell me something good about her." Duke smiled. that rare, transforming expression. She has this laugh that sounds like music. When she was 4, she'd laugh at everything. Silly faces, her own jokes that didn't make sense, the way leaves sounded when you walked through them. Even during the court-martial, even when everything was falling apart, I could close my eyes and hear that laugh and remember why I was fighting. Do you still hear it? Every day. And I imagine she's still laughing, even though I'm not there to hear it. That's what gets me through. At 2 o'clock, they gathered in Judge Morrison's chambers, a smaller, less formal space than the courtroom. The judge sat behind her desk, looking tired. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony carefully," she began. "This is a difficult case because both parents clearly love Caroline and want what's best for her. However, the law requires me to consider the child's best interests above all else." Margaret felt her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. "Mr. Ashford, your concerns about your ex-wife's judgment are not entirely without merit. However, they are also not supported by the evidence of the past 5 years. Mrs. Ashford has maintained sobriety, followed every court requirement, and demonstrated significant personal growth. Her decision to employ Mr. Harrison, when examined in full context, actually demonstrates sound judgment rather than recklessness." Judge Morrison looked at Richard. "Your motion to terminate visitation is denied. Furthermore, I'm modifying the custody arrangement to increase Mrs. Ashford's visitation to twice monthly, with a review in 6 months to potentially transition to unsupervised visits if the current progress continues." Margaret couldn't breathe. Twice monthly. A path to unsupervised visits. "Your Honor!" Richard started to protest. "Mr. Ashford, I understand your protective instincts, but Caroline has a mother who has worked extremely hard to deserve a place in her life. Continuing to punish Mrs. Ashford for a mistake made 5 years ago, when she has demonstrated consistent rehabilitation, serves no one's best interests, least of all Caroline's. Children benefit from knowing both parents when both parents are safe and committed to their welfare. Mrs. Ashford has proven she meets that standard." After they left the courthouse, Margaret stood on the steps feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet, but this time in a good way. "Twice monthly," she whispered, "and possible unsupervised visits." "You won," Duke said, and the pride in his voice made her want to cry. "We won. You standing up there telling the truth about what happened to you. That mattered. The judge saw that I was willing to look beyond accusations to evidence, that I could make careful decisions instead of fearful ones." David shook both their hands. "Congratulations, Margaret. This is a significant victory. Now follow every requirement to the letter, document everything, and in 6 months we'll push for those unsupervised visits." That evening, Margaret and Duke sat in the garden as sunset painted the Charleston sky in shades of amber and rose. The fountain Duke had restored sang its gentle song, and the roses her mother had planted bloomed in careful rows. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now you get to be Caroline's mother, twice a month instead of once. You get to build a relationship with her, help her understand who you are. It won't be easy, but it's a chance." "I meant with us." Duke took her hand. "With us. I think we take it slow. We let whatever this is develop naturally. We don't hide it, but we don't rush it either. We give you time to strengthen your relationship with Caroline. We give ourselves time to figure out if what we feel right now can survive real life, not just crisis." "That sounds very reasonable and mature. I've learned that the things worth having are worth doing right." He squeezed her hand. "I spent 3 years fighting to clear my name, and even after I won, I lost Emma. I don't want to make that mistake again, winning the battle but losing what matters most, because I didn't think carefully about the approach." Over the following months, Margaret's life developed a new rhythm. Twice monthly visits with Caroline, each one a small opportunity to rebuild connection. The first few were awkward. Caroline still called her Miss Margaret and seemed uncertain about what this woman wanted from her. But gradually, patiently, Margaret began to appear in Caroline's life as a constant presence rather than a confusing stranger. She learned about Caroline's love of horses, her fear of thunderstorms, her habit of organizing her stuffed animals by color. In November, 4 months after the hearing, something shifted. Caroline was coloring at the table in the visitation center when she looked up and said, "Miss Margaret, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, sweetheart. Sometimes I have dreams about a lady who sang to me, songs about mockingbirds and diamonds. Was that you?" Margaret's throat closed. She'd sung those songs every night during Caroline's first year of life before everything fell apart. "Yes, baby, that was me. I thought maybe it was. The lady in the dreams smells like you do, like roses and something else, something nice. Lavender soap. I've used the same kind for years." Caroline considered this. "If I wanted to, could I call you Mom instead of Miss Margaret? Or would that make Mommy Julie sad?" Margaret chose her words carefully, aware the social worker was documenting everything. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, Caroline. I would love it if you called me Mom, but only if you're comfortable with it. And I think Miss Julie loves you enough that she'd understand you can love more than one mom. Daddy says I should only have one mom. He says it's confusing otherwise." "It might be confusing sometimes, but lots of things in life are confusing, and we figure them out anyway. The important thing is that you feel loved and safe, and you call people what feels true to you." Caroline went back to coloring, but a few minutes later she said, "Mom, can you tell me more about when I was a baby?" And Margaret did, tears streaming silently down her face while she told her daughter about the first time Caroline had smiled, the way she'd like to sleep with her tiny hand curled around Margaret's finger, the songs they'd shared in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. At the 6-month review hearing in March 1972, Judge Morrison reviewed the social worker's reports with a small smile. "Mrs. Ashford, the progress documented here is remarkable. Caroline has begun asking to call you Mom. She talks about you between visits, and she's expressed interest in spending more time with you. I'm granting unsupervised visitation, 1 full day per month initially, with the possibility of overnight visits if the next 3 months continue positively." Richard looked like he'd bitten into something sour, but he didn't protest. Even he could see that fighting Margaret's success would only make him look vindictive. After the hearing, Margaret called Duke from a payphone outside the courthouse. "Unsupervised visits," she told him, her voice shaking with joy. "A full day. I can take her to the park, to lunch, show her the house and the garden. Duke, she's calling me Mom." "I'm proud of you," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Come home and celebrate." Home. The word settled over her like grace. Somewhere along the way, the house on Meeting Street had stopped feeling like a mausoleum of past mistakes and started feeling like a place where life happened. That summer, Margaret brought Caroline to the house for the first time since the divorce. Caroline was 8 now, curious and bright, and she explored the garden with wide-eyed wonder. "This is where you live? It's like a princess castle." "It's where my family has lived for a long time, and yes, it's pretty special." Caroline ran through the paths Duke had restored, laughing at the fountain, trying to count all the roses. When Duke emerged from the carriage house, Caroline stopped short. "Who's that?" "That's Mr. Harrison. He's the groundskeeper who makes the garden so beautiful. Duke, this is my daughter Caroline." Duke crouched down to Caroline's level. "It's nice to meet you, Caroline. Your mom talks about you all the time." "She does, all the time. I know you like horses and science class and the color purple." Caroline giggled. "How did you know that?" Because people who love you pay attention to the things that make you happy. Over the next year, Caroline's visits increased, first to twice monthly full days, then to weekend visits, then to a week each summer. Richard gradually, grudgingly accepted that Margaret had genuinely changed and that Caroline benefited from knowing her mother. Julie, surprisingly, became an unexpected ally. She pulled Margaret aside at Caroline's 9th birthday party, the first event where they'd all been present together, and said quietly, "I never wanted to replace you. Richard made it seem like the only option was for me to be her only mother. But I can see how hard you've worked, and Caroline deserves to have you in her life." "Thank you," Margaret said, surprised by the gesture. "And thank you for loving her when I couldn't be there." Duke and Margaret's relationship deepened slowly, carefully. They'd learned from their past mistakes not to rush, not to assume that love alone solved complicated problems. They went to church together, had dinner with Mrs. Patterson, took walks through Charleston's historic streets, and gradually built something steady and true. In the spring of 1973, Duke received a letter from Emma. She was 11 now, and her mother had finally agreed to let Duke have phone calls twice a month instead of just letters. "She wants to know about my life," Duke told Margaret, staring at the letter with wonder. "She asked if I'm happy, if I have friends, what I'm doing for work. She's curious about me." "That's wonderful. What will you tell her?" "The truth. That I work with gardens, that I've found peace in Charleston, that I've met someone who makes me remember what it's like to hope for good things." Over time, Duke's relationship with Emma began to rebuild through letters and phone calls, and eventually, when Emma was 13, a visit to Charleston that her mother agreed to. Emma met Margaret and Caroline, and the four of them spent an awkward but ultimately sweet afternoon together. Two parents who'd lost custody, two daughters who'd been told one version of their parents' stories and were now discovering the fuller truth. On a warm October evening in 1974, Duke asked Margaret to marry him in the garden he'd restored. It wasn't a grand gesture, just the two of them by the fountain at sunset, with Mrs. Patterson watching from the kitchen window with satisfaction. "I know it's complicated," Duke said. "I know we both have histories that will follow us, but I think we've proven that broken people can build something whole together. Will you marry me?" Margaret said yes, and when they told Caroline the news, she clapped her hands and said, "Does this mean Mr. Duke will be my stepdad? Can I call him that?" "If he's okay with it," Margaret said. Duke knelt down to Caroline's level, just as he had when they'd first met. "I would be honored to be your stepdad, Caroline. I promise to always tell you the truth, support your relationship with your mom, and be someone you can count on." They married in December in a small ceremony at St. Michael's Church with Mrs. Patterson, Caroline, Emma, David Brennan, and a handful of close friends present. Richard and Julie sent a gift, an olive branch of sorts, acknowledging that this new configuration could work for Caroline's benefit. By 1975, Margaret had been granted joint custody with a flexible visitation schedule. Caroline spent summers with Margaret and Duke, alternating holidays, and had begun asking if she could live with them full-time when she was older. Richard had softened over the years, particularly after Julie encouraged him to recognize that his vendetta had been about his own hurt rather than Caroline's welfare. One evening, Margaret stood in the same spot where she'd stood years earlier, looking out over the garden at sunset. But this time Duke was beside her, and Caroline was inside doing homework at the dining room table where Margaret had once eaten alone. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Duke asked. "All the time. If I hadn't made that terrible mistake, Caroline would have known me her whole life. If you hadn't been falsely accused, Emma would have grown up with her father. We paid such high prices for circumstances that were partly our fault and partly beyond our control. But we also learned something important, that people are more than their worst moments, that change is possible, that love can grow even in damaged soil if you tend it carefully. Margaret leaned against him. The garden metaphors are getting out of hand. He laughed. Occupational hazard. Inside, Caroline called out, "Mom, can you help me with my math homework?" "Coming, sweetheart," Margaret called back. As she walked toward the house, toward her daughter, toward the life she'd rebuilt through patience and honesty and refusing to give up, Margaret thought about Judge Morrison's words from years ago. Caroline benefited from knowing both parents when both parents were safe and committed to her welfare. She'd proven she could be that parent. Not perfect, never perfect, but present and trying and genuinely devoted to Caroline's happiness. And Duke had proven he could be a true partner. Someone who understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future that honored both what you'd lost and what you'd learned. The mansion on Meeting Street still carried its history. The portraits of judgmental ancestors, the rooms that echoed with old expectations. But now it also carried laughter, homework sessions, Duke's work boots by the back door, Mrs. Patterson's humming as she cooked Sunday dinners, and the kind of imperfect, hard-won happiness that comes from refusing to let mistakes be the end of the story. Some gardens grew best, Margaret had learned, when you didn't shy away from the damaged soil, but worked with it, understanding that the richest growth sometimes came from the places that had been broken and carefully, patiently tended back to life.